Hey, welcome back, friend. Or maybe this is your very first time here. And if it is, I am so glad you found your way. Get comfortable. Pull your blanket a little closer. Tonight, we are not going anywhere stressful. We're going somewhere far more fascinating and far more scandalous than anything you will find on your phone right now. Because tonight we're stepping through the gilded front door of Victorian high society. A world of silk gowns, diamond tiaras, and impeccably mannered lords and ladies who smiled at dinner parties while absolutely destroying each other behind closed doors. And I promise you, by the time this story is over, you are going to look at that word proper and laugh. Are you ready? Because I have been waiting to tell you this. If you are enjoying this kind of storytelling, slow, deep, a little bit dramatic, then do me one small favor before we go any further. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like if it feels like the kind of thing you want to come back to. You can even drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from tonight, what time it is, whether you're cozy in bed or half asleep on the couch. I genuinely love hearing from you. Every single comment means more than you know. Now dim the lights if you have not already. Let the fan run softly in the background, and let us begin. Picture England in the year 1851. Queen Victoria is 32 years old, radiant, powerful, and deeply in love with her husband, Prince Albert. The Great Exhibition has just opened in Hyde Park, inside a magnificent greenhouse made of iron and glass, a building so extraordinary that people called it the Crystal Palace. Over 6 million visitors came to see it. 6 million people in a country of less than 21 million. That is more than 1 in 4 people on the entire island. The message was impossible to miss. Britain is at the top of the world. Britain is civilized. Britain is good. And that word good was everything in Victorian England. Goodness was not just a virtue. It was a currency. It was armor. It was the single most important thing a person in high society could possess. Because without it, you had nothing. Without goodness, or rather, without the appearance of goodness, the doors of every drawing room in London would slam shut in your face one by one, and you would disappear from polite society as completely as if you had never existed at all. This obsession with respectability was not just social pressure. It was almost a religion. And like many religions, it had one face for the public and a completely different face behind closed doors. Let me paint you a picture of what the Victorian social world actually looked like. From roughly May through the end of July each year, the British aristocracy descended on London for what they called the season. This was not a holiday. This was a competition. Mothers dressed their daughters in white, always white, the color of purity, and paraded them before eligible young lords in a ritual that was basically a very expensive, very polished, very socially acceptable livestock auction. The goal was simple: find a husband of equal or greater rank and fortune before the season ended. The center of this world in the earlier decades of Victoria's reign was a place called Almack's Assembly Rooms on King Street in the St. James district of London. A plain, almost unimpressive building from the outside, but inside it was everything. 7 aristocratic women, they were called the Lady Patronesses, held absolute power over who received a voucher to enter. The Duke of Wellington himself was once turned away at the door because he arrived 7 minutes late and was wearing trousers instead of knee breeches. The Duke of Wellington, the man who defeated Napoleon I at Waterloo, turned away for trousers. That tells you everything you need to know about how seriously these people took the rules. But here's where it gets interesting. Because the rules, all those elaborate, suffocating, beautifully embroidered rules, were never really about morality. They were about appearance. There is a difference, and the Victorians understood it perfectly, even if they never said it out loud. A gentleman could keep a mistress on the other side of London, visit her 3 times a week, and attend church on Sunday, without a single eyebrow raised, provided he was discreet. A married woman could carry on an affair for years, provided she was never publicly found out. The sin was not the behavior. The sin was getting caught. And women, as always, played by a different set of rules entirely. For a man, a scandal might cost him his club membership for a season, maybe a few dinner invitations, maybe a stern conversation with his father-in-law. For a woman, the same scandal could mean total annihilation, ostracism, divorce without a penny, her children taken away, her name spoken in whispers, and never kindly until the Matrimonial Cause Act of 1857. Divorce in England required a private act of Parliament. A woman who wanted to leave her husband had to essentially petition the government of the entire country. Historians estimate that in the 200 years before that act, fewer than 4 women in England had ever successfully obtained a divorce through that process. 4 women in 200 years. And even after 1857, when divorce became technically possible through the courts, a husband could divorce his wife for adultery alone. But a wife, she had to prove adultery plus cruelty, or adultery plus desertion, or adultery plus some other aggravating factor, because apparently a husband straying was just Tuesday. Now, let's talk about the thing nobody in polite Victorian society ever talked about directly, which, of course, was the most interesting thing happening at any given moment. The journalist Henry Mayhew spent years documenting the lives of ordinary Londoners, and in the 1850s, he estimated that there were approximately 80,000 women working as prostitutes in the city of London alone, 81 in a city of about 2 million people. Historians debate the exact numbers, but even the most conservative estimates are staggering. And who were the clients? Not just the poor and the desperate. The street-level trade lived in the East End, yes, but in the West End, in the expensive supper rooms off the Haymarket, in the quiet private clubs of St. James's. The clients were lords, members of Parliament, army officers, clergymen, the very men who stood in Parliament and debated the moral decay of the working classes. This was the Victorian secret hiding in plain sight, and everyone knew it. Everyone. The newspapers danced around it in coded language. The clergy thundered about sin from the pulpit. The police periodically swept certain streets in certain neighborhoods to make the problem less visible. Not less real, just less visible. Because visibility was the enemy, not immorality, visibility. And this perfect, fragile, impossibly maintained illusion. This is the world into which we are about to step. A world where a royal prince could stand in a court of law because of a messy divorce. Where a man who might have been prime minister could have his entire career wiped out by a single accusation. Where a woman who had done nothing worse than fall in love with the wrong person could be sentenced to death. Where a quiet little brothel on a quiet little street in London could bring a government to its knees. The Victorians built the most spectacular cage ever constructed, polished it until it shone like gold, and then spent 64 years pretending it was a palace. What happened when the bars started to show? That is the story we're going to tell together tonight. And I should warn you, the first crack in that gilded surface comes from the very top, from the man who would one day be king. There is something almost unbearable about watching a perfect world begin to crack. And in the winter of 1870, the first crack in Victorian high society's gilded surface did not come from some dark alley in the East End, or from a working-class radical stirring trouble in the newspapers. It came from a drawing room, a very beautiful, very expensive drawing room belonging to a 21-year-old woman named Harriet Mont. Let me tell you about Harriet. She was by every measure that Victorian society valued a success story. Born Harriet Monreef, daughter of a Scottish baronet, she was educated, graceful, and considered one of the great beauties of her generation. In 1866, she married Sir Charles Mordaunt, a wealthy conservative member of Parliament from Warwickshire. She was 18. He was 30. The match was considered excellent. For a few years, everything looked exactly as it was supposed to look. And then, in the spring of 1869, Harriet gave birth to a baby girl. The child was born with a condition that caused problems with her vision, and something in that moment seemed to break something loose inside Harriet Mortant entirely. She went to her husband, and what she said next would set off a chain of events that would shake the British monarchy to its foundations. She confessed to everything. She told Sir Charles that she'd been unfaithful to him, not once, not twice, but with multiple men. She named names, and one of those names delivered in her husband's private study on a quiet English afternoon was Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, the future King of England. Now, pause for just a moment and think about what that meant, not just socially, legally, constitutionally, because in 1870, the Prince of Wales was not some distant ceremonial figurehead. He was the heir to the throne of the most powerful empire on earth, an empire that at that moment controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land surface and a quarter of its population. The monarch was not just a symbol. The monarch was the moral center of the entire national identity. Queen Victoria had spent decades carefully constructing that image. The devoted wife, the grieving widow after Prince Albert's death in 1861, the embodiment of virtue, and now her son, her eldest son, the heir, was about to have his name read aloud in an English divorce court. Sir Charles Morant filed for divorce on the grounds of adultery. He named 3 men as correspondents. The first was Viscount Cole, the second was Sir Frederick Johnston, and the third listed in the court documents as a co-respondent whose involvement would require his personal appearance, was the Prince of Wales himself. Think about that for a moment. Has anything like that ever happened before or since a future king subpoenaed, called to answer questions under oath about his private conduct? The answer in British history is no, not before and not since. The trial opened in February of 1870 at Westminster, and London went absolutely wild. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse in weather that was, this is February in England, remember, genuinely miserable. Newspapers sold out within hours of hitting the stands. Ladies who had normally never acknowledged that scandal existed suddenly found urgent reasons to visit their solicitors in the vicinity of Westminster Hall. The Times of London covered every single day of proceedings in extraordinary detail. The public appetite was insatiable. What they were really hungry for, of course, was not justice. They wanted to see whether the Prince of Wales would actually show up, whether he would stand in that room and answer those questions under oath. He did. On February 1870, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, took the stand at Westminster. He was 28 years old. He was, even his critics admitted, composed. He answered the questions put to him by counsel in a calm, measured voice. He acknowledged that he knew Lady Mortant. He acknowledged that he had corresponded with her letters, social notes, the ordinary currency of Victorian upper-ass acquaintance. He denied categorically and under oath any improper relationship. The exchange, according to court transcripts, was remarkably brief. The prince's counsel had done their work carefully. The questions were narrow. The answers were controlled, and within the space of perhaps 20 minutes, the heir to the British throne stepped down from the witness box and walked back out into the cold February air. He had survived, technically, but here's the thing about surviving a scandal in Victorian England. Surviving it legally was only half the battle. What mattered, what always mattered, was what happened in the court of public opinion. And public opinion was not entirely convinced those letters. The letters between the prince and Harriet Mont. There were reported to be at least 6 of them, and possibly more were never fully produced in court. Sir Charles's legal team argued that their content was relevant. The prince's team argued successfully that they were not. The letters were described in testimony as innocent social correspondence, nothing more. But the very existence of the correspondence, the very fact that a married woman and a royal prince had been exchanging private notes, was enough to make a significant portion of the British public deeply uncomfortable. Republican sentiment in England, which had been building quietly since Prince Albert's death, left Victoria in a long and very public withdrawal from royal duties, reached what historians now consider its peak intensity in the months following the Mort-Tant trial. A pamphlet titled, "What Does She Do with It?" questioning the Queen's use of public funds while she remained largely out of sight, sold over 100,000 copies, a Republican group organized by Sir Charles Dilke. And you will hear more about Dilke himself very soon because his own story is extraordinary, claimed hundreds of thousands of supporters. The monarchy was genuinely vulnerable, more vulnerable arguably than at any point since the English Civil War 2 centuries earlier. Meanwhile, what happened to Harriet Mant? This is the part of the story that I find myself coming back to long after the prince has walked out of that courtroom and the lawyers have packed up their papers and gone home for the evening. During the trial, Sir Charles' legal strategy shifted in a startling direction. Rather than pressing the adultery case directly, as counsel argued that Harriet Mant was of unsound mind, that her confessions were the product of mental illness, not memory. The tactic worked. The court accepted that Lady Mont was not mentally competent to stand trial in the divorce proceedings. She was committed to a private asylum. She would remain institutionalized in various establishments for the rest of her life. She died in 1906, 36 years after that confession in her husband's study, still confined, never having regained what Victorian society called her liberty. Was she genuinely ill? Possibly. The circumstances of her confinement have been debated by historians for over a century. Some argue that her breakdown was real and her care by the standards of the time appropriate. Others point to the remarkably convenient timing. A woman whose testimony could damage a royal prince suddenly deemed unfit to testify and raise questions that do not have comfortable answers. I am not going to tell you what to think about that. I will only say this. In Victorian England, a woman's credibility and a woman's freedom were two things that could be taken away at virtually the same moment, by virtually the same people, for virtually the same reasons. That is worth sitting with for a little while. The Mantic officially ended without a verdict on the adultery question. Sir Charles eventually obtained his divorce through a later proceeding. He remarried. He lived a long, quiet, largely unremarkable life in Warwickshire. The Prince of Wales went on to become the most famous and most openly pleasure-seeking member of the British royal family in a generation. His social circle, the wealthy and fashionable set that gathered around him and followed his lead in everything from fashion to horse racing to late-night supper parties, became known simply as the Marlborough House set. And for the next 2 decades, scandals would follow that circle the way certain kinds of weather follow the English coast persistently, predictably, and with a particular damp chill. But the scandal coming next, the one that erupted just 6 years after the Mont trial, was something different in kind. Not a divorce proceeding, not a woman's confession. This one was a threat, cold, calculated, and directed straight at the throne, and the man who issued it was the father of the most famous Englishman of the 20th century. 6 whole years passed after the Manton trial. 6 years of dinners, horse races, country house weekends, and the Prince of Wales moving through English high society like a warm current through cold water, charming everything around him and leaving a trail of complications in his wake. His friends adored him. His mother largely despaired of him, and the newspapers watched him with the patient, hungry attention of an animal that has learned where the feeding happens. By 1876, the prince was 34 years old. He had a wife, the beautiful Alexandra of Denmark, by all accounts, a woman of genuine grace and genuine suffering, who understood perfectly the nature of the arrangement she had married into, and bore it with a composure that I personally find both admirable and quietly heartbreaking. He had children. He had his clubs, his race horses, his cigars, and his circle of friends. And one of those friends in the winter of that year was about to cause him more trouble than anything that had come before. The friend's name was Spencer Compton Kendish. No. Wait. Let me give you the name that actually appeared in the newspapers, because Victorian aristocrats had a talent for accumulating titles the way other people accumulate debt. He was Lord Blandford, the Marquis of Blandford, elder son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, heir to Blenheim Palace, one of the grandest private houses in England. And Lord Blandford was conducting a passionate, reckless, completely indiscreet love affair with a married woman. Her name was Edith, Countess of Alresford. Her husband, the Earl of Alresford, known to his friends as Sporting Joe, which tells you something, was away in India traveling with the Prince of Wales on a grand royal tour. While Sporting Joe was riding elephants and attending state banquets on the other side of the world, his wife and Lord Blandford had essentially stopped pretending to be discreet. This in itself was serious, but manageable. Victorian aristocratic marriages had weathered worse. There were procedures, quiet conversations, tactful withdrawals. A small number of people would know, a larger number would suspect, and as long as nobody forced the matter into the open, life would continue its graceful, hypocritical rotation. But then, Edith made a decision that changed everything. She told her husband she wanted a divorce. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that genuinely surprised me the first time I read it, and I suspect it will surprise you too. When Lord Alresford received his wife's letter in India, his first instinct was not to negotiate or to rage privately, or to do any of the 100 quietly civilized things that Victorian gentlemen were supposed to do in these situations. His first instinct was to go directly to the Prince of Wales, who was after all right there, and tell him everything. And the prince, loyal to his friend and furious at Blandford's behavior, immediately agreed to help. He wrote letters. He made his position clear. A divorce, he felt, would be a scandalous mess that would embarrass everyone. And Blandford should be made to understand that. The problem was that Lord Blandford had a younger brother. His name was Lord Randolph Churchill. He was 26 years old, already a member of Parliament, already showing the brilliant, unstable, combustible quality that would define his entire career. He was also fiercely, almost irrationally devoted to his family's honor. And when he learned that the Prince of Wales was actively working against his brother, writing letters, mobilizing social pressure, essentially using the full weight of royal influence to force a particular outcome in a private family matter, Lord Randolph did not accept it quietly. He decided to fight back, and his weapon of choice was the most dangerous thing in Victorian England private letters. Lord Randolph had somehow obtained the exact circumstances remain unclear, and historians have debated them for decades. A collection of letters that the Prince of Wales had written to Edith, Countess of Alresford in earlier years. What exactly was in those letters nobody living today can say with complete certainty, because they were never produced in court and were almost certainly destroyed. But Lord Randolph's claim, delivered in person to the Princess of Wales herself, in a confrontation that must rank among the most extraordinary private meetings of the entire Victorian era, was that their contents were so damaging, so personally compromising to the heir to the throne, that if they were ever read aloud in a divorce court, Albert Edward would never sit upon the throne of England. Think about that sentence for a moment. A 26-year-old member of Parliament standing in front of the Princess of Wales telling her that he possessed letters capable of destroying the monarchy. That is not a social impropriety. That is not a scandal in the drawing room sense. That is something close to a declaration of war. The Princess of Wales, by all accounts, was shaken. Queen Victoria, when she learned what had happened, and she learned very quickly, was incandescent. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, was drawn into consultations. The machinery of royal and government response, usually reserved for matters of actual national security, began turning over a private dispute between aristocrats about who was conducting a love affair with whose wife. What happened next reveals something important about how power actually worked in Victorian England, which is to say, it worked very differently depending on which side of it you were standing on. The Prince of Wales, furious beyond what diplomatic language could adequately describe, challenged Lord Randolph to what amounted to a duel, or rather, demanded satisfaction, in the manner that gentlemen of that era understood. Lord Randolph declined to meet him in that way. The letters remained in Lord Randolph's possession. The threat remained alive. The resolution, when it came, was achieved not through confrontation but through calculation. Lord Randolph had overplayed his hand, and in the cold light of reflection, he likely knew it. He had made the Prince of Wales his personal enemy. He had alarmed the Queen. He had placed himself in the position of a man who had threatened the crown of England, which was not a position that offered comfortable long-term prospects. The Elford divorce was quietly dropped. Edith Alsford and Lord Blandford did not marry. They eventually separated, and Blandford later divorced his own wife and remarried someone else entirely, as the genuinely rich and titled often managed to do when the rules became inconvenient. The letters were presumably returned or destroyed, and Lord Ranulph Churchill, brilliant and reckless and 26 years old, was sent to Ireland, not imprisoned, not prosecuted, not socially destroyed in the way a less well-connected man certainly would have been, simply removed. His father, the 7th Duke of Marlborough, was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, which was a position of considerable prestige and considerable distance from London. And Lord Randolph, with his wife Jenny and their infant son, a boy named Winston, born in November of 1874, went with him. The exile lasted 3 years. When Lord Randolph returned to London, he returned with a hunger and a political sharpness that some historians trace directly to those 3 years of enforced distance from the center of things. He became one of the most electrifying parliamentary performers of his generation. He rose to Secretary of State for India, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, a position he then catastrophically resigned from in 1886 in a miscalculation so spectacular that it effectively ended his political career. He died in 1895 at 45 years old, having never reached the heights that his talent once seemed to promise. His son Winston watched all of this, absorbed all of it. The brilliance and the self-destruction, the willingness to gamble everything on a single card, the particular Churchill combination of extraordinary courage and occasionally catastrophic judgment. When you read about Winston Churchill's career, the wilderness years, the moments of visionary defiance, the moments of near-fatal overreach, you can see the echo of that drawing room in 1876. The son of the man who once threatened a king. There is something I keep returning to in this story, and it is this: Lord Randolph's gamble was not actually about protecting his brother's honor. His brother, Lord Blandford, had behaved badly and knew it. The gamble was about power, about a young, ambitious man from one of England's great families looking at a prince who was using royal influence as a private weapon and deciding with extraordinary nerve to push back. Was he wrong to do it? Was he right? Victorian England never quite decided. History never quite decided either. What history did decide is that the letters were the real weapon. And in a world where reputation was everything, where words written in a private moment could become instruments of public destruction, the person who controlled the letters controlled the story. We will see that principle at work again and again and again across every scandal in this video. But the next one is different from anything we've encountered so far because it does not involve royalty. It does not involve politics. It involves a quiet house in Surrey, a glass of Burgundy wine, and a man who went to bed one night feeling slightly unwell and never woke up. Some stories stay open forever. Not because the people involved were careless or because the investigation was lazy or because the evidence disappeared, but because the truth, whatever it was, got buried so carefully inside a world of secrets and social performance that no amount of legal procedure could ever fully dig it out. The death of Charles Bravo in April of 1876 is that kind of story. It is the kind of case that Victorian England obsessed over that two separate public inquests examined in exhausting detail, that newspapers covered for months, that readers debated in letters and drawing rooms and railway carriages, and that nobody to this day has ever definitively solved. I want to be honest with you about that up front. I'm not going to give you a tidy ending tonight because there is no tidy ending to give. What I can give you is something almost more interesting, a window into how Victorian society processed the possibility that a woman might have had very good reasons for doing something it could never bring itself to say out loud. Charles Bravo was 30 years old in the spring of 1876. He was a barrister, a lawyer trained in the English courts from a comfortable and respectable family. He was by most accounts a man of considerable charm and considerable temper. In December of 1875, he had married a widow named Florence Ricardo, and the two of them had moved into a large, pleasant house called the Priory in Balham, South London, which was then a quiet, leafy suburb, the kind of place that Victorian professionals moved to when they wanted fresh air and the appearance of country life within easy distance of the city. Florence was 29. She was attractive, financially independent. Her first husband had left her very well provided for, and she had a reputation that Victorian society had already spent some time examining with less than charitable attention. Before her marriage to Charles Bravo, she had maintained a close relationship with a physician named Dr. James Gully. Dr. Gully was 64 years old. He was a celebrated figure in medical circles, known for his pioneering work with what was called the water cure, a therapeutic approach to illness that had attracted patients including Charles Dickens, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Florence Nightingale, among many others. He was also inconveniently a married man. The relationship between Florence and Dr. Gully had lasted roughly 4 years. By the time Florence married Charles Bravo, it had ended formally at least. But it had happened. People knew it had happened. And in Victorian England, a woman with that particular history in her past was a woman walking a very narrow path for the rest of her life. On the evening of the 18th of April, 1876, Charles Bravo ate dinner at the Priory with Florence and her companion, a widow named Mrs. Jane Cox. The meal was unremarkable. Some wine was consumed. Accounts vary on the quantity and vary depending on watching which witness you believe, which is itself a detail worth noting. After dinner, Charles went upstairs. Within minutes, he was calling for help. He was in severe pain. He was vomiting. The symptoms that followed over the next 3 days before Charles Bravo died on the 21st of April were consistent with poisoning by antimony, specifically antimony potassium tartrate, a substance known at the time as tart-armetic. It was a slow, agonizing end. Several doctors attended him. He was lucid at intervals, confused at others. When asked directly whether he might have taken anything himself, he denied it. When asked whether he could think of any reason for his condition, he said he could not. The post-mortem confirmed it. A fatal dose of antimony had been found in his body. The question was not what had killed him. The question was how it got there and who put it there. The first inquest held in the weeks following his death returned a verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown. That verdict forced a second, much larger inquest, one of the longest and most expensive inquests in Victorian English legal history, running for 23 days in the summer of 1876 and generating coverage that filled the newspapers day after day after day. 3 people were seriously considered. The first was Florence herself. She had motive in the sense that Charles Bravo had been, by multiple accounts, a controlling and sometimes cruel husband in the 5 months of their marriage. He had managed her finances aggressively, reduced her household expenses, dismissed servants she was attached to, and according to testimony from Mrs. Cox, had at times treated Florence with a harshness that went well beyond Victorian notions of ordinary marital authority. Florence had also, according to some testimony, made remarks in private that suggested she was deeply unhappy. The second was Mrs. Jane Cox, Florence's companion, a woman in a financially dependent position, who had her own complicated relationship with the household, and whose testimony shifted in ways that the inquest legal counsel found difficult to reconcile. The third, the most sensational possibility, was Dr. Gully himself, the elderly physician who had loved Florence, who'd been cut off from her by the marriage, and who had the medical knowledge to understand precisely what antimony would do and how it would be administered. Here is what I find most revealing about the entire case, and this is the part where I want to offer you my own reading, not just the facts. The Victorian inquest system was not designed to be fair to women. It was designed to be fair to property, to reputation, and to the social order. And throughout both inquests, the real subject on trial was not who poisoned Charles Bravo. The real subject on trial was Florence's past, her years with Dr. Gully, her financial independence, her refusal, even under enormous pressure, to be a figure of pure victimhood. The newspapers that covered the case in such obsessive detail were not primarily interested in justice. They were interested in the spectacle of a woman with a complicated history being made to explain herself in public to a room full of men. Florence was never charged with anything. No one was ever charged with anything. The second inquest's final verdict was again willful murder by person or persons unknown. The legal process had consumed months of testimony, thousands of words of reported evidence, and the intimate details of Florence's private life, and had produced exactly nothing in the way of resolution. What it had produced was destruction of a different kind. Florence Bravo, Florence Ricardo. Before that, Florence Campbell by birth retreated from public life after the inquest. She moved to South Sea. She drank heavily by all accounts in the years that followed. She died in September of 1878, just 2 years after her husband at the age of 33. The cause of death was recorded as complications related to excessive alcohol consumption. She was 33 years old. Dr. Gully, whose name had been dragged through the entire proceedings, despite his never being formally accused of anything, was effectively expelled from polite society. His medical reputation built over decades evaporated. He died in 1883, largely forgotten. Mrs. Cox immigrated to Jamaica and spent the rest of her life there, as far as history can tell, in complete silence on the subject. So, who did it? I have read the transcripts. I followed every argument that serious historians and amateur investigators have advanced over the past century and a half. There are compelling cases to be made in multiple directions, and I am genuinely, honestly, not certain. What I'm certain of is this: the truth, if it exists anywhere, exists in the gap between what people said under oath and what they actually knew. And in Victorian England, that gap was often very wide indeed. What I keep coming back to is a smaller truth sitting quietly underneath the larger mystery. A woman married a man who made her unhappy. She had a past that her society could not forgive her for. When something terrible happened in her house, that past became the story louder than the evidence, louder than the grief, louder than anything else. And when the legal process was finished and the newspapers had moved on to the next sensation, she was 33 years old and drinking herself to death in a house by the sea. The mystery of who poisoned Charles Bravo has never been solved. The mystery of what Victorian society did to Florence Bravo is not a mystery at all. We have spent the last few chapters in the world of private homes and private griefs, divorce courts and drawing rooms, and the quiet devastation of lives played out in the newspapers. But the next scandal takes us somewhere different, into Parliament, into the very machinery of British democratic power, and into the story of a man who should have been Prime Minister, who everyone, including the Prime Minister himself, believed would one day be prime minister, and whose entire future was taken apart piece by piece in a courtroom over something that happened in a bedroom. His name was Sir Charles Dilke, and his story is one of the most politically consequential scandals of the entire Victorian era. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever watched someone who seemed destined for greatness? Genuinely, obviously, almost mathematically destined simply disappear. Not through failure, not through a lack of talent or effort or intelligence, but through one catastrophic moment that rewrote every sentence of the story that had been building around them. Because that is exactly what happened to Sir Charles Dilke. And the reason I find his story so endlessly uncomfortable, more uncomfortable in some ways than the royal scandals and the murder mysteries we've already visited, is that it sits at the precise intersection of private behavior, public power, and a legal system that was never quite designed to determine the truth, only to produce a verdict. And verdicts, as we have seen, are not always the same thing as truth. By the mid-1880s, Sir Charles Dilke was one of the most admired politicians in England, not admired in the polite arm's-length way that Victorians admired ceremonial figures. Admired seriously, professionally, in the way that people in political life admire someone, when they genuinely believe that person is going to run the country one day. He was 42 years old. He had served as a member of Parliament since 1868. Years of steady, brilliant, parliamentary work that had taken him from the backbenches to the inner circle of the Liberal Party with unusual speed. William Gladstone, who was himself one of the towering political intellects of the century, had appointed Dilke to the cabinet as president of the local government board in 1882. He was considered Gladstone's natural successor, not one of several possible successors, the natural one, the heir apparent of British liberalism. He was also, it should be said, a genuine radical in the most interesting sense of that word. He had traveled widely, written seriously about imperial policy, and held views on democratic reform, on the extension of voting rights, on local government, that was substantially ahead of where the political mainstream was prepared to go. His book on Greater Britain, published in 1868, had sold well and been taken seriously as an intellectual contribution to questions of empire and identity that Victorian England was only beginning to grapple with. He was not just a career politician climbing the standard ladder, he was a man with actual ideas. And in 1885, all of it, every year of it, every idea, every carefully built political relationship, every expectation of what the next decade might bring, came apart over a divorce case. The case began with a man named Donald Crawford, a Scottish solicitor and Liberal member of Parliament. In July of 1885, Crawford filed for divorce from his wife, Virginia, on the grounds of adultery. The man he named as the partner in that adultery was Sir Charles Dilke. Virginia Crawford was 22 years old. Dilke was 42. They moved in the same political and social circles Dilke had known Virginia's mother, Mrs. Eustacia Smith, for many years, and had been a friend to the extended family. Whether or not anything improper had occurred between Dilke and Virginia was the question that the divorce court was now asked to answer. Virginia's own testimony was the heart of the case, and it was by any measure extraordinary in its detail. She described not one or two encounters, but a sustained relationship conducted over a period of time at a house in Sloane Street. She provided specifics, dates, circumstances, the kind of granular, memorable detail that is very difficult to fabricate convincingly, and equally difficult to disprove conclusively when no one else was present. Dilke denied everything absolutely categorically in the most direct terms available to him. He had not had any improper relationship with Virginia Crawford. He had never behaved in any way toward her that was inconsistent with ordinary social acquaintance. He was being accused falsely and he was prepared to say so in court. Here is the problem. He never got to say it in court. Not properly. Not in the first trial. This is the procedural twist that I want you to pay close attention to, because it is the part of the Dill case that legal historians still find genuinely troubling more than a century later. Under Victorian divorce law as it stood in 1885, the alleged third party in a divorce case, the person accused of adultery alongside one of the spouses, was not automatically a party to the proceedings. They could petition to be heard, but if the divorce was uncontested between the actual married couple, the case could proceed and conclude without the accused third party ever having a full opportunity to cross-examine witnesses or present their own defense. Donald Crawford did not contest the divorce. He wanted Virginia to be found guilty of adultery with Dilk, and he was prepared to let that finding stand. Virginia did not contest it either. She was in fact the one making the accusation, which meant that the legal mechanism that would normally have protected Dilk, the right to face his accuser in full adversarial proceedings, simply did not apply in the way it should have. The divorce was granted in February of 1886. The judge found that Virginia Crawford had committed adultery with Sir Charles Dilk. Dilk himself had not been a formal party to those proceedings in the way that permitted him a complete defense. The political consequences were immediate. He resigned from Parliament. The career that Gladstone and half of liberal England had been watching as a generational promise effectively ended in the space of a few weeks. Dilk was not finished fighting. He pushed for a second trial, a separate Queen's Bench proceeding, in which he would be a full party with full rights of examination and cross-examination, and in which he could present his case properly. That trial came in July of 1886. It did not go as he had hoped. Virginia Crawford repeated her testimony under cross-examination by Dilk's counsel. She held her ground with a composure that many observers found either impressive or alarming, depending on their prior sympathies. Dilk's own testimony was hindered by a problem that was not entirely of his making. He had, in the months before the scandal broke, conducted a genuine affair with another woman, not Virginia Crawford, but a woman named Mrs. Christina Roger, and the tangled attempts to explain his whereabouts on certain dates without fully exposing that separate relationship created gaps in his account that his opponents exploited with considerable skill. The jury deliberated and then returned a verdict that gave neither side a clean resolution. They found for Dilk on some counts and against him on others, or more precisely, they could not agree. The judge directed a verdict, and the outcome was not the full vindication Dilk had sought. He contested a parliamentary seat again in 1886 and lost. He eventually returned to Parliament in 1892, representing the Forest of Dean, and served there until 1911, but the cabinet was never open to him again. The premiership, which had once seemed simply a matter of waiting, never came. He spent the last 25 years of his political life as a respected but peripheral figure, the man who might have led the country contributing quietly from the backbenches. I want to be careful here about something. I'm not going to tell you that Dilke was innocent. I genuinely do not know whether he was innocent. Nobody alive today can know that with certainty. What I can tell you is that the legal process by which his career was destroyed was profoundly inadequate to the task of determining the truth. The first trial, the one that actually produced the finding that ended his political life, was a proceeding in which he did not have full participatory rights. That is not a technicality. That is a fundamental problem. And I cannot help but notice that the accusation was of the type that Victorian society found almost uniquely impossible to adjudicate fairly, because the social stakes of appearing to disbelieve a woman were themselves enormous. And yet the social stakes of disbelieving a man of Dilk's standing were also enormous, and the two pressures did not resolve each other into clarity. They resolved into noise, into suspicion that attached itself permanently, regardless of what any court eventually found. There is a particular kind of injustice, not dramatic, not violent, not the stuff of Gothic novels that is simply the slow, permanent staining of a reputation by unresolved doubt. Dilke lived with that stain for the rest of his life. He died in January of 1911, at 67 years old, having never been formally convicted of anything and having never been formally cleared of anything. That is its own particular kind of sentence. What strikes me most looking back across the 5 stories we've visited so far is a pattern that keeps asserting itself. Power in Victorian England was not just about money or title or political office. Power was about the ability to control the narrative, to decide which version of events became the official story. The Prince of Wales survived his courtroom appearance in 1870 because his narrative was managed. Lord Ranulph Churchill survived his confrontation with royal displeasure because he had leverage. Even in the Bravo case, the narrative of Florence's past overwhelmed the narrative of her grief. Dilke did not have that kind of narrative control, and without it, even brilliance and innocence, or what may well have been innocence, were not enough. But the next case in our story tonight takes a different angle entirely, because this time the scandal was not about one man's fall, and it was not about one woman's past. This time it was a spectacle, a public theatrical event that Victorian England consumed with something very close to open delight, because both sides came out swinging, and absolutely nobody emerged with their dignity intact. 4 men named in a divorce court, 1 furious wife, and newspapers that could barely print fast enough to keep up. If the Dilke case was a slow, suffocating tragedy, the kind that unfolds in whispers and procedural documents, and the quiet closing of doors, then the Lady Colin Campbell divorce was something else entirely. It was a circus, a magnificent, appalling, absolutely riveting Victorian circus conducted in public, covered by every major newspaper in England and several in America, watched by crowds who gathered outside the courtroom, the way people today gather outside film premieres. It lasted 4 weeks. It featured 4 men accused of adultery with the same woman simultaneously. It had a general, a lord, a duke's son, and a chief of the Metropolitan Fire Brigade. And at the center of it all was a woman who, unlike nearly every other woman we have encountered in this story so far, refused absolutely, and without apology, refused to be quietly destroyed. Her name was Gertrude Elizabeth Blood. You know her from history as Lady Colin Campbell, and she is, I think, one of the most genuinely remarkable people in this entire video. Gertrude came from a landed Irish family, not fabulously wealthy, but respectable, educated, with the kind of social standing that opened certain doors without quite opening all of them. She was intelligent in the way that made Victorian drawing rooms slightly nervous. She read seriously. She had opinions. She expressed them, and she was not particularly interested in performing the softness that polite society expected from women of her class. She was also, by the accounts of people who knew her, and the portraits that survive, strikingly beautiful, which in Victorian England meant she was simultaneously admired and treated with a faint, persistent suspicion. In 1881, she married Lord Colin Campbell, the youngest son of the 8th Duke of Argyll. Colin was 27. Gertrude was 24. On paper, the match had everything Victorian society asked for the title family connection reasonable means. What it did not have, and what became apparent almost immediately, was a functioning marriage. Lord Colin Campbell had contracted syphilis before the marriage. How long before, and whether Gertrude was informed of this before the wedding, became one of the bitterly contested questions of the subsequent legal proceedings. What's not contested is that Gertrude became seriously ill shortly after the marriage, ill in ways that her doctors attributed with increasing certainty to a transmitted infection, and that the couple's relationship deteriorated rapidly and comprehensively from that point forward. By 1883, they were living essentially separately. By 1884, they were both consulting solicitors, and in 1886, Lord Colin filed for divorce, naming 4 men as his wife's alleged partners in adultery. Now, those 4 names, because this is the part that made the case the sensation of the decade. The first was General Sir William Butler, a distinguished military figure, veteran of numerous campaigns, the kind of man whose face appeared in illustrated papers above words like decorated and distinguished. The second was the Duke of Marlborough's son, Lord Blandford. Yes, the same Lord Blandford from the Alresford affair we discussed earlier, who had apparently learned absolutely nothing from that experience and was now appearing as a correspondent in a completely different scandal a decade later. I genuinely cannot decide whether this is tragic or impressive. Perhaps both. The third was a doctor named Dr. Thomas Bird Gertrude's personal physician, which added a particularly uncomfortable layer of betrayal of trust to the proceedings. And the fourth was Captain Eyre Massey Shaw, the chief officer of the Metropolitan Fire Brigade, a man so celebrated in London society that he had been immortalized in a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta just a few years earlier. In the operetta, Ianthe, the fairy queen herself, sings to Captain Shaw by name, asking whether her heart of fire could be quenched by his streams. Captain Shaw, ladies and gentlemen, was famous enough to be written into a comic opera, and now he was being named in a divorce court. Victorian England did not know quite whether to be scandalized or entertained. It resolved the dilemma by being both enthusiastically at the same time. But here is what made the Campbell case fundamentally different from the cases we have followed before. And this is the part I find genuinely important, rather than simply sensational. Lady Colin Campbell did not accept the role of defendant. She filed a cross petition. She accused Lord Colin of adultery, in return naming a woman called Mary Watson, with whom she claimed he had carried on a relationship. She contested every single allegation against her. She hired aggressive counsel, she showed up, she testified, she cross-examined. She fought the case with the tenacity and a directness that Victorian courtrooms were deeply unaccustomed to seeing from a woman of her social position. The trial opened in November of 1886 at the Probate, Divorce, and Admiralty Division of the High Court of Justice, which is a wonderfully Victorian name for a court that was essentially where complicated, embarrassing, expensive human disasters went to be formally processed. It ran for 4 weeks. 4 weeks of daily testimony, daily cross-examination, daily newspaper coverage that read, sometimes like court reporting and sometimes like serialized fiction. The parade of witnesses was extraordinary. Servants testified about what they had seen or claimed to have seen through partially open doors and across garden walls and during household routines that brought them into proximity with their employers' private lives. In Victorian households of the upper-class servants were simultaneously invisible and omnipresent, and both sides used that omnipresence ruthlessly. Gertrude's counsel suggested that certain servants had been coached or financially motivated to remember things a particular way. Lord Colin's counsel suggested the same thing about the servants favorable to Gertrude. The medical testimony was particularly striking. Gertrude's doctors testified about the state of her health after the marriage. The clear implication in counsel for her side made it as explicit as the court would permit was that Lord Colin's pre-existing condition had been transmitted to his wife, and that his filing for divorce while concealing his own culpability in the breakdown of her health was an act of profound bad faith. This was genuinely radical territory for an 1886 courtroom. The notion that a wife might have grounds for grievance against a husband who had concealed a serious medical condition before marriage, and that this context might matter in the adjudication of her subsequent behavior, was not something Victorian divorce law was well equipped to process. The law asked, did she commit adultery? It did not ask what was the full context in which this marriage existed. It did not ask was she given the information she needed to make an informed choice about her own life. Those questions hung in the air of the courtroom unanswerable under the applicable statutes. And then the verdict came. After 4 weeks, 4 men named hundreds of pages of testimony and coverage that had kept England glued to its newspapers through the autumn and into winter. The jury found that Gertrude had not committed adultery with any of the 4 men named. Not one. Lord Collins' petition was dismissed entirely, but his cross-petition, the counter-accusation Gertrude had filed against him, was also dismissed. Neither party was granted a divorce. They remained technically married, a marriage that had been publicly examined in the most intimate possible detail, that had dragged 4 prominent men through public accusation, that had produced weeks of testimony about servants and doorways and private conversations, and had ended with both parties still legally bound to each other, and neither having obtained what they came for. Lord Colin Campbell died in 1895. The marriage ended only because he did. Gertrude, freed at last from the legal entanglement, built a life that I find quietly extraordinary given everything she had been through. She became a respected journalist and art critic. She wrote for major London publications. She published a book called Etiquette of Good Society in 1893, which has a certain dry irony to it, given that polite society had spent the better part of a decade trying to exclude her from its ranks. She wrote art criticism that was taken seriously. She was, by all accounts, happy in her later years in a way that her earlier ones had not permitted. She died in 1911 at 54 years old, the same year as Sir Charles Dilke. As it happens, though, the two had nothing else in common except the experience of having been publicly examined by Victorian society and found in some complicated way wanting. Here is what I take from her story, sitting with it now at a comfortable distance of nearly 140 years. Gertrude Campbell fought back in a way that almost no woman in her position had done before. She had every reason to retreat, to accept a quiet settlement, to remove herself from public view, to do the thing that Victorian society was practically begging her to do, which was to disappear gracefully and stop making everyone uncomfortable. She did not do that. She looked at the legal process that was being used against her, and she used it right back. She was not vindicated in any tidy sense. She was not celebrated by her contemporaries the way her courage perhaps deserved, but she did not let the story be told without her voice in it. That in the context of 1886 was genuinely remarkable, and it was, as it happens, about to be tested because 2 streets over from the respectable world of divorce courts and newspaper coverage. Something else was happening in London in 1889, something that did not involve a drawing room or a courtroom at all, but a quiet house on a quiet street, and a scandal that reached, if the rumors were to be believed, all the way to the gates of Buckingham Palace itself. Most of the scandals we have visited so far began in drawing rooms, in courtrooms, in the carefully managed social spaces where Victorian high society conducted its public performances of respectability. They began with letters or confessions, or a husband filing papers with the solicitor on a rainy afternoon. This one began with stolen postal orders. The man who had become the most powerful advocate for Catholic Ireland's self-determination was himself Protestant, Anglo, Irish Cambridge, educated, and thoroughly comfortable in the drawing rooms of Westminster. This was not a liability. In many respects, it was his greatest political asset because it made him impossible to dismiss as a dangerous outsider. He spoke the language of Parliament fluently, literally, and figuratively, and he understood its rhythms in ways that allowed him to use them against the institution itself with extraordinary skill. He entered Parliament in 1875 as member for County Meath, and within a remarkably short time had transformed the Irish Parliamentary Party from a loose collection of protest voices into the most disciplined, unified, strategically sophisticated political grouping at Westminster. He did this through a combination of iron personal authority, tactical brilliance, in a technique of obstruction, using Parliament's own procedural rules to bring government business to a standstill until Irish grievances were addressed, that the House of Commons had never encountered in that form before and found genuinely difficult to counter. By the early 1880s, he had secured something extraordinary: the personal political investment of William Gladstone, the Liberal Prime Minister, in the cause of Irish Home Rule. Gladstone, who was one of the great parliamentary minds of the century, had become convinced that some form of Irish self-governance was not just politically necessary, but morally right, and the alliance between Gladstone's Liberals and Parnell's Irish Party represented the most realistic chance Ireland had ever had within the constitutional framework of the United Kingdom of achieving a measure of democratic self-determination without bloodshed. That is what was on the table. That is what was in the room. And then there was Catherine. Catherine O'Shea, known to everyone who wrote about her as Kitty, though she apparently disliked the nickname, was the wife of Captain William Henry O'Shea, an Irish member of Parliament from County Clare. She was intelligent, warm, possessed of considerable personal charm, and deeply unhappy in her marriage. Captain O'Shea was, by the evidence of everyone who knew the household, a man who combined social ambition with personal unreliability, in proportions that made sustained domestic harmony essentially impossible. He was also in the way of certain Victorian husbands, simultaneously unwilling to maintain the marriage and unwilling to release his wife from it. Parnell and Catherine O'Shea met in the summer of 1880 when Parnell was 34 and she was 35. The connection between them was by the later testimony of both immediate and serious. Within a year it had developed into a relationship of real depth and genuine mutual devotion, not the careless, opportunistic kind of affair that Victorian high society was entirely familiar with managing, but something that looked in retrospect rather more like a love story than a scandal. They conducted this relationship for nearly a decade. For nearly a decade, Parnell used Catherine O'Shea's house in Elam in southeast London as effectively his English home. He corresponded with her constantly, thousands of letters over the years, letters that were tender and playful and entirely unlike the tightly controlled public figure that Westminster knew. She managed his correspondence when he was ill-mediated his communications with Gladstone, facilitated political negotiations on his behalf. She was not merely his private companion. She was in many practical respects his political partner. And through most of that decade, the arrangement was what Victorian England called an open secret, known or suspected by a significant number of people, including Captain O'Shea himself, who found the situation useful enough in terms of the political access it gave him to manage his indignation selectively. What changed everything was money. Catherine O'Shea had a wealthy aunt, a woman named Mrs. Benjamin Wood, who'd provided Catherine with financial support for years, and whose estate Catherine expected to inherit substantially. When Mrs. Wood died in 1889, the will was contested by other family members. The legal disputes over the estate dragged on, and Captain O'Shea, who had tolerated his wife's arrangement with Parnell, partly because it suited him, and partly because it connected him to political power, now found himself in financial difficulty and concluded that the relationship's usefulness to him had expired. In December of 1889, Captain O'Shea filed for divorce, naming Charles Stewart Parnell as the correspondent. The case was heard in November of 1890. Neither Parnell nor Catherine contested it. The details of the relationship, the meetings, the correspondence, the years of shared domestic life in Elam were laid before the court without defense. The divorce was granted. The facts were now public formally and completely in the plainest possible legal language. And Victorian England, which had known or suspected most of this for years, chose that moment to be shocked. I've thought about this a great deal, and I think the shock was not really about the facts. The facts were old news. The shock was about the formalization of the facts. Once something is in a court record, once it has been stated under oath in legal proceedings and reported in the newspapers in the language of formal finding, it exists differently. It can no longer be navigated around with the practiced social fluency that Victorian high society used to manage these situations. It had to be responded to publicly by everyone. The response destroyed everything. The Catholic Church in Ireland, which had with varying degrees of enthusiasm supported the Home Rule movement because Parnell had delivered results, moved against him with a speed and ferocity that surprised even those who had predicted some kind of reaction. The bishops issued statements. The clergy preached against him. In a country where the Church's social and moral authority was immense, genuinely immense, not merely ceremonial, this was politically catastrophic. Gladstone, watching from Westminster, wrote to the Irish Parliamentary Party that he could no longer lead the Liberal Party in alliance with a man whose position had made the Home Rule cause a political liability. The letter was carefully worded. Gladstone was too sophisticated a politician to frame it as a moral judgment, but the meaning was clear enough. Either Parnell stepped back from the leadership of the Irish Party, or the Liberal alliance that was the vehicle for Home Rule was over. The Irish Parliamentary Party split bitterly, irreconcilably, with a savagery that surprised observers who had watched Parnell forge it into such a disciplined instrument over 15 years. The majority voted to remove him from the leadership. A minority remained loyal. For the last year of his life, Parnell led a rump party fighting constituency by constituency to rebuild what had been dismantled in a matter of weeks. He died on the 6th of October, 1891, at his home in Brighton. He was 45 years old. He had married Catherine O'Shea in June of that churchy year, 4 months before his death. The cause of death was given as acute rheumatism. Those who knew him in the final month spoke of a man who'd been worn through, not by illness alone, but by the specific exhaustion of watching something irreplaceable collapse around him and being unable to stop it. Here is the part that I genuinely cannot make my peace with, no matter how many times I turn it over. The Home Rule Bill of 1886, Gladstone's first serious legislative attempt to give Ireland a degree of self-government, failed in Parliament by 30 votes. 30. After the Parnell crisis destroyed the Liberal Irish alliance and shattered the Irish Party, a second attempt in 1893 passed the House of Commons, but was defeated in the House of Lords. A third attempt, the Government of Ireland Act of 1914, became law, but was immediately suspended at the outbreak of the First World War. By the time any form of Irish self-governance was actually implemented, the constitutional path had been abandoned, and the alternative had cost thousands of lives. 30 votes in 1886. One relationship revealed in a divorce court in November of 1890. I am not suggesting that a single scandal caused the entire subsequent history of Ireland. History is never that simple. But I'm suggesting that the destruction of Parnell removed from the board the one political figure who had demonstrated in practice the ability to hold together the specific coalition, liberal English opinion Irish parliamentary discipline, and Gladstone's personal commitment that the constitutional route required, and that removal at that precise moment mattered in ways that echoed for a generation. It is also worth noticing something about who did the destroying. Captain O'Shea's decision to file for divorce was driven primarily by financial calculation. The Catholic bishops who turned on Parnell were responding to public pressure as much as they were generating it. The members of the Irish Parliamentary Party who voted to remove him were many of them making a pragmatic judgment about electoral survival rather than a principled stand about morality. Almost no one in the entire unraveling was primarily motivated by genuine moral outrage. Almost everyone was responding to incentives, financial, political, institutional, electoral. The machine that crushed Charles Stewart Parnell was not a machine of righteous indignation. It was a machine of competing interests that found in his exposed private life a useful lever. That, I think, is the most Victorian thing about the entire story. We're almost at the end now. Just 2 more stops. The next one brings us back to where this particular thread of Victorian legal history began. Back to the LaBare Amendment that we mentioned in the Cleveland Street chapter. Back to the law that criminalized private conduct between men, and forward to the most famous trial of the entire Victorian era. If Charles Stewart Parnell's story is the one that changed the map of nations, then the story coming next is the one that changed the map of minds slowly, painfully, over a century of slow movement, inch by inch, toward a world that the man at its center would have barely recognized. His name needs no introduction, but his story told properly might surprise you. Everybody knows the name. Not everybody knows the story, and I mean that genuinely, not as a rhetorical opener, but as something I have noticed over years of reading about this period. People know Oscar Wilde the way they know a song they have heard 100 times but never sat down and actually listened to. They know the wit, the dandy, the green carnation, and the fur coat, and the remarks so polished they barely seem like something a human being would say in ordinary conversation. They know vaguely that something terrible happened to him. They know prison was involved, but the specific mechanics of what happened, the precise sequence of decisions, each one building on the last, each one carrying him a step further past the point of return, that is a story that deserves to be told slowly, because every step of it was a choice, and understanding why he made those choices is, I think, one of the more illuminating things you can do with an evening. Oscar Fingal O'Leary Wills Wilde was born in Dublin on the 16th of October 1854. His father was Sir William Wilde, one of the leading ironer surgeons in Ireland and a man of considerable intellectual range. His mother was Jane Francesca Wilde, who wrote nationalist poetry under the pen name Speranza, and held a famous literary salon in Dublin that was by all accounts one of the more extraordinary gatherings of the age. Oscar grew up in a household where ideas were taken seriously, where words were prized, and where the performance of brilliance was considered a legitimate and worthy endeavor. He went to Trinity College, Dublin, then to Magdalen College at Oxford, where he won the Newdigate Prize for poetry and developed the aesthetic philosophy, the belief that beauty was its own justification, that art existed for art's sake and not for moral instruction that would define his public identity for the rest of his life. He arrived in London in the early 1880s as a figure already half constructed. The velvet jacket, the lily, the peacock feather, the carefully cultivated air of someone who found everything slightly beneath him, while simultaneously being delighted by all of it. In 1884, he married Constance Lloyd, a woman of intelligence and genuine warmth, who loved him, as far as anyone can tell, with sincerity and without reservation. They had 2 sons, Cyril, born in 1885, and Vivian, born in 1886. By the early 1890s, Oscar Wilde was at the absolute peak of his powers and his public reputation. He had written the novel that would outlast everything else, The Picture of Dorian Gray, published in 1890. He had written the plays that made him the most talked about playwright in London, Lady Windermere's Fan in 1892, A Woman of No Importance in 1898, An Ideal Husband, and The Importance of Being Earnest, both in 1890. The Importance of Being Earnest opened at the St. James's Theatre in London on the 14th of February 1895. It was by the reception of the first night audience and the reviews that followed a triumph. Wilde had written his masterpiece. He was 40 years old. He was by any reasonable measure at the summit, and 11 weeks later he was in handcuffs. The man who set the catastrophe in motion was John Sholto Douglas, the 9th Marquess of Queensberry. You may know the name from a different context. Queensberry had given his name to the rules that governed modern boxing codified in 1867, which represented something about his personality. A man who believed in rules and structure, in the proper ordering of contests, and who had very little patience for what he considered violations of the natural order. His youngest surviving son was Lord Alfred Douglas, 24 years old in 1895. Extraordinarily handsome, a poet of genuine, if uneven, talent, and possessed of a temperament that combined charm, recklessness, and a capacity for sustained emotional drama that exhausted everyone around him, including eventually Wilde himself. Wilde had met Douglas in 1891. The friendship that developed between them was the central relationship of the last decade of Wilde's life. Complicated, consuming, alternately ecstatic, and genuinely painful, and impossible to discuss in Victorian England in any direct language. Queensberry loathed the connection between his son and Wilde with a ferocity that was partly paternal, partly social, and partly something hard to name. He had already lost one son, his eldest Viscount Drumland Rigg, who had died in October of 1894 in circumstances that were officially ruled a shooting accident and privately suspected by many, including Queensberry himself, to be something else. The Queensberry family was not by 1895 a family at peace with itself. On the 18th of February, 1895, just 4 days after the triumphant opening of The Importance of Being Earnest, Queensberry left a calling card at Wilde's club, the Albemarle Club in Mayfair. The card was addressed to Wilde. On it, Queensberry had written in his characteristically imprecise spelling for Oscar Wilde posing some dite. He had misspelled the word he was using to destroy a man's life. I find that detail almost unbearable in its smallness. Wilde received the card 10 days later when he collected it from the hall porter. He read it. He had in the days that followed a choice. The choice was this: ignore the card. Let the insult stand uncontested in the way that Victorian gentleman was supposed to absorb private insults and continue with his life. His friends, and he, had friends who understood the stakes far more clearly than he did, or perhaps simply more dispassionately urged this course. Ignore it. The Marquis is erratic. The card was left at a private club. It need not become public. Let it go. He did not let it go. Instead, on the 1st of March, 1895, Oscar Wilde applied for a warrant to arrest the Marquis of Queensberry for criminal libel. His legal team was led by Mr. Edward Clarke, a distinguished advocate. He was advised as the case developed that the prosecution would be risky. He pressed forward. Here is the thing about prosecuting someone for libel in Victorian England. The defendant's most powerful defense was justification, to prove that what they had written was in substance true. And Queensberry's legal team, led by Edward Carson, a barrister of formidable skill, who had been at Trinity College, Dublin at the same time as Wilde, and knew him distantly from those years, began immediately building a justification defense. They employed private investigators. They gathered witnesses. They assembled evidence. When the Lyell trial opened at the Old Bailey on the 3rd of April, 1895, Edward Carson began his cross-examination of Oscar Wilde with what became one of the most celebrated exchanges in English legal history. He asked Wilde about his writings, about his relationships, about the young men in his circle, and Wilde, brilliantly, fatally, with the habitual confidence of someone who had spent 20 years being the smartest person in every room, began to perform. He was witty. He was evasive. He was, as he always was, captivating. And Carson methodically and without haste was building a cage out of his own words. On the 4th day of the trial, Wilde withdrew the prosecution. The case against Queensberry was abandoned, and under the rules of Victorian criminal procedure, a judge could direct that the costs of the defense be paid by the losing party, which meant that Queensberry's legal bills, which had been considerable, now fell to Wilde. That detail mattered because it left him financially exposed at precisely the moment when he needed resources most. More importantly, the abandonment of the Seal case meant that the evidence Carson had assembled, the witness statements, the documented associations, was now effectively in the hands of the prosecution. Queensberry's solicitor, within hours of the verdict, sent the evidence to the Director of Public Prosecutions. Wilde was arrested on the 5th of April, 1895, at the Cadogan Hotel in Chelsea, where he had been sitting with Lord Alfred Douglas and a friend drinking hock and seltzer and waiting. There was a train to France. His friends had arranged it. The boat train was still running. Paris was within reach. He did not take the train. Why not? He was asked this in various ways by various people for the rest of his life. The answers he gave were not always consistent, but the most considered version, the one that appears in his letters, in the long, extraordinary document he wrote in prison that was later published as Drafundis, suggests something important that he understood on some level, that running would mean accepting the verdict of his enemies before it had been formally delivered, that the act of staying was itself a kind of statement, that Oscar Wilde, who had built his entire public identity on the proposition that how one lived was itself a form of art, could not bring himself to live the rest of his life as a fugitive. There is also the possibility, and this is my own reading, offered carefully, that some part of him was too exhausted to run, that the weight of the previous 4 years, the emotional intensity of the relationship with Douglas, the litigation, the financial strain, the accumulated pressure of maintaining a public performance of effortless brilliance, while the private reality was increasingly chaotic, that some part of him simply had nothing left with which to construct an escape. There were 2 criminal trials. The first, which began on the 26th of April, ended with a hung jury after the jurors could not reach agreement on the primary charges. The second trial opened on the 20th of May and concluded on the 25th. The jury returned a verdict of guilty. Justice Alfred Wills, delivering the sentence, said that the case was the worst he had ever tried, and that the maximum sentence available to him was inadequate to the gravity of the offense. He sentenced Oscar Wilde to 2 years of hard labor. In the courtroom, people cheered. Outside the courtroom on the streets, there were other reactions. Constance Wilde, who had remained in England and had visited her husband during the interval between trials, arranged for their sons to be taken abroad and given new names, Cyril and Vivian Holland. Holland being her grandmother's maiden name. She was trying to protect 2 small boys from a world that had decided their father's name was an instrument of shame. Cyril was 9. Vivian was 8. Wilde served his sentence at 3 institutions: Pentonville, Wsworth, and finally Reading Jail, where he spent the larger portion of his imprisonment. The conditions of Victorian hard labor, the treadwheel, the oakum, picking, the restricted diet, the near-total isolation, were brutal in the clinical, systematic way that the Victorians had perfected. His health deteriorated significantly. He was permitted to write in the final months of his imprisonment, and what he wrote was Drafundis, a letter addressed to Douglas running to 50,000 words, which is by any measure one of the most remarkable documents of grief and self-examination that the 19th century produced. He was released on the 19th of May, 1897. He crossed to France, immediately traveled to Normandy, and then to Naples, and eventually settled in Paris under the name Sebastian Melmoth, the name taken from a Gothic novel and from the patron saint of outsiders, which tells you everything about the register in which he was now living. He wrote one more substantial work after prison, The Ballad of Reading Jail, published in 1898 under the designation C3.3, his prison cell number, not his name. It sold well, the reviews were serious. It was the last thing he published in his lifetime. Constance died in April of 1898 in Genoa from complications following a spinal operation. She was 40 years old. They had not seen each other after his release. There had been plans. faltering attempts at communication, the possibility of reunion that neither of them managed to cross the distance to achieve. Oscar Wilde died on the 30th of November, 1900, in the Hotel Dals in Paris. He was 46 years old. The cause of death was cerebral meningitis, likely connected to an ear infection that had gone untreated since a prison fall. He had been received into the Catholic Church on his deathbed by a priest named Father Cuthbert Dunn, making good some felt on a long-standing sympathy that he had never formalized during his healthier years. And then something happened that Victorian England had not expected. He did not disappear. The plays came back slowly, cautiously, without his name on the programs for years because his name was still considered too dangerous. But the plays came back because they were too good to stay away. The Importance of Being Earnest is currently the most frequently performed play by any Victorian playwright anywhere in the world. Dorian Gray has never gone out of print. De Pundis is read by people who've never opened another Victorian text in their lives. The law that imprisoned him, the Labouchere Amendment, which we discussed in the Cleveland Street chapter, was repealed in England and Wales in 1967, 72 years after his conviction. A formal pardon for Wilde and for the thousands of other men convicted under the same statute was granted by the British government in 2017, 122 years after the trial. Think about that number for a moment. 122 years. That is how long it took Victorian England's legal judgment to be formally acknowledged as wrong. I said at the beginning of this chapter that Oscar Wilde's story is the one that changed the map of minds, that by losing he became closer to a winner than almost anyone else in this video. I meant something specific by that. Every other person in this story was damaged by their scandal and then in one way or another disappeared from history's active attention. The Madds, the Alsfords, Florence Bravo, Charles Dilke, the Campbell divorce, Florence Mabry, Charles Stewart, Parnell. All of them are historical figures now remembered, by specialists occasionally revisited in books and documentaries, but not living presences in the cultural conversation. Oscar Wilde is different. Oscar Wilde is still here in theaters, in bookshops, in the specific way people reach for a quotation when they want to describe something beautifully and devastatingly true about human vanity or hypocrisy, or the mask we wear in polite company. He is more present now, arguably, than at any point since the first night of The Importance of Being Earnest. Victorian England tried to erase him. It did not succeed, and that, in the full context of everything we've discussed tonight, feels important enough to sit with for just a moment before we arrive at our final stop. We have been through 10 scandals tonight. 10 stories of drawing rooms and courtrooms and letters and verdicts, and the elaborate machinery that Victorian high society used to manage, punish, and occasionally destroy the people who stepped outside its lines. The last chapter is the one where we step back, where we look at the whole picture at once, where we ask the question that has been sitting underneath every story we have told. What does all of this actually tell us about power, about gender, about the distance between the rules a society claims to live by and the rules it actually operates under, and about whether any of this, in the most uncomfortable sense, is really finished? We have come a long way tonight, from the Crystal Palace and the gilded drawing rooms of 1851 to 20 courtrooms, and a dozen private disasters past princes and politicians and poisoners and playwrights. And now we are here at the end with all of it spread out behind us like a landscape you can finally see clearly because you've climbed high enough to look back. I want to use this last chapter differently from the others. Not to tell another story, but to look at the ones we've already told and ask what they actually mean. Because I believe that history is only half useful if you consume it as entertainment. The other half, the part that makes it worth the time, is what you do with the patterns once you have seen them. And the patterns in Victorian scandal are not subtle. Once you know how to look for them, they are everywhere. Let's start with the most obvious one, and then move toward the ones that are harder to name. The obvious pattern is this. In virtually every scandal we've examined tonight, women were punished more severely than men for equivalent conduct. And in many cases, they were punished for conduct that was not equivalent at all. That was in fact a direct response to mistreatment they had received first. Harriet Mant confessed to infidelity and spent 36 years in an asylum. The Prince of Wales, whose name she mentioned in that confession, spent those same 36 years attending race meetings and house parties, and eventually became king. Florence Bravo's past relationship with Dr. James Gully was treated in the inquest into her husband's death as effectively equivalent to evidence of guilt. Not legal evidence, but the kind of moral atmosphere that made everything else about her look suspicious. Dr. Gully was socially ruined. Charles Bravo's own conduct during the marriage was almost entirely absent from the proceedings. Florence Mowbray's admitted love affair was the framework within which an ambiguous poisoning case was presented to a jury. James Mowbray's parallel household of 5 children by another woman was barely mentioned. Lady Colin Campbell fought back in a way that none of the other women in this story managed, and she was rewarded for it with 4 weeks of public dissection, the permanent attachment of a contested reputation to her name, and a marriage she could not legally exit for another 9 years. I am not presenting this as a revelation. These women knew it. Every woman in Victorian England knew it. The rules were not hidden. The double standard was not a secret operating in the shadows. It was the publicly acknowledged operating principle of the entire system, defended openly by men in Parliament, in court, in the press, and from the pulpit. What strikes me sitting with it now is not the injustice itself, but the extraordinary energy it required to maintain. The constant performance of outrage at behavior that was simultaneously tolerated, expected, and in many cases actively participated in by the same people doing the performing. That is not hypocrisy in the simple dismissible sense. That is a sophisticated social technology for managing power, and it worked with remarkable consistency for the better part of 6 decades. The second pattern is about class, and it connects directly to what we saw in Cleveland Street. Go back through the 10 stories we have told and ask a simple question. Who was prosecuted? Who was actually convicted? Actually imprisoned? Actually had their life materially destroyed rather than merely socially inconvenienced Henry Newlove, a telegraph boy? Months of hard labor. Ernest Park, a journalist, 12 months in prison for naming powerful men in connection with a matter of public concern. Florence Mowbray, an American woman without the connections or resources that English aristocratic women could draw on. 15 years of penal servitude. Oscar Wilde, a man of considerable fame but no political protection, no family title, no institutional affiliation that could absorb the blow on his behalf. 2 years of hard labor. Now look at the other side. Lord Arthur Somerset, an extended holiday in the south of France for 37 years, the Prince of Wales twice called as a witness in scandal. Proceedings twice survived, without legal consequence of any kind, eventually crowned King Edward III. Lord Ranulph Churchill, 3 years in Ireland, then a return to Parliament and one of the most celebrated careers in Victorian politics. Lord Blandford appeared as a co-respondent in not one, but 2 major scandals across a 10-year period, and continued to live at Blenheim Palace. The system was not blind. The system had very good eyesight. It simply chose with great consistency to look in a particular direction. Now, here is the third pattern, and it is the one I find most unsettling, because it is the one that travels most directly from 1895 to the present day. Victorian scandal was fundamentally a mechanism of narrative control. Every single case we've examined tonight was at its core a competition over which version of events would become the official story. And the side that controlled the narrative, who had access to the best lawyers, who had the social connections to keep certain evidence out of court, who had the resources to commission private investigations, or the influence to discourage prosecution that side won. Not always, but consistently enough to constitute a system. The letters were always the key. Remember what we said in the Alsford chapter, that the person who controlled the letters controlled the story. That principle was not unique to that case. The entire Victorian scandal machine ran on the management of private written evidence. Who had seen the letters? Whether the letters could be produced in court, whether the letters could be destroyed before they were subpoenaed, whether the person who wrote them could be persuaded coerced, or simply outlasted. In the Morant case, the prince's letters were described as innocent and kept largely out of evidence. In the Alsford case, Lord Randolph Churchill's power came entirely from the letters he possessed. In the Dilke case, the destruction of his career was achieved without his having a full opportunity to challenge the evidence against him. In the Bravo case, letters between Florence and the household physician were cited in testimony in ways that shaped the atmosphere of the inquiry without being fully examined. The pattern is not coincidental. The Victorians understood at some deep intuitive level that control of private written communication was control of public reputation, and through public reputation, control of professional, legal, and social outcomes. We now live in a world where the volume of private written communication produced by any individual in a single week would have seemed unimaginable to a Victorian. Messages, emails, posts, comments, photographs, an ocean of documentation of private thought and private behavior. Most of it stored somewhere, much of it recoverable. The Victorian anxiety about letters has not gone away. It is simply scaled up by several orders of magnitude. That is not a comforting thought to end on. So, let me offer you a different angle. Consider who survived. Not survived in the narrow legal sense of avoiding prison or keeping their title, survived in the larger sense whose life, whose work, whose presence persisted and mattered beyond the scandal that had been intended to end them. Oscar Wilde's plays are performed every night somewhere in the world. Gertrude Campbell, who refused to disappear quietly, built a genuine second career as a journalist and critic, and lived on her own terms for 3 decades after the trial that was supposed to finish her. Florence Mabry, after 15 years of imprisonment, returned to the United States and wrote her own account of what had happened to her, the first person in any of our stories to insist on controlling her own narrative in that direct, published, permanent way. Charles Stewart Parnell failed to achieve his political goal, but the name and the cause he represented became part of the foundation on which Irish national identity was built in the 20th century. His statue stands in O'Connell Street in Dublin, at the north end of the city's main thoroughfare, and it has stood there since 1911. What these survivors share is not innocent. Some of them were guilty of exactly what they were accused of, and knew it. What they share is a refusal to accept the story that Victorian society was trying to tell about them as the only story available. Each of them, in their different ways, continued to exist as a subject, rather than an object, as someone who acted and chose and wrote and built, rather than someone to whom things simply happened and who then vanished. That refusal in the context we've been describing required genuine courage, not the dramatic battlefield kind, the quieter, more sustained kind of, the courage to keep going when the mechanisms of a powerful society are arranged specifically to encourage you to stop. And now I want to ask you the question I've been building toward all evening. Is Victorian hypocrisy finished? I do not mean the specific forms, the specific laws, the specific social rituals, the specific vocabulary of respectability that the Victorians used to perform their elaborate theater of public virtue. Those are gone, or mostly gone, or have at least changed their costumes beyond easy recognition. I mean the underlying structure, the gap between the values a society publicly professes and the behavior it privately permits, and the specific consistent way that gap is managed, so that the people with the least power bear the greatest cost of maintaining the illusion. because every generation believes with total sincerity that it has moved past the hypocrisies of the generation before. The Edwardians thought the Victorian cage had been opened. The 1920s thought the Edwardian gentility had been swept away. Each successive decade has looked back at its predecessor with a mixture of amusement and mild superiority, convinced that the particular blindnesses of the past are no longer operative. And in each generation there have been people, usually the people with the least institutional protection, who could have told them otherwise. I am not saying nothing has changed. Enormous things have changed. The legal landscape of the United Kingdom and the United States in 26 would be unrecognizable to a Victorian magistrate in ways that matter profoundly to real people's real lives. The Laboucher Amendment is gone. Women can own property practice law, vote, serve in Parliament and Congress and on the Supreme Court. The specific forms of injustice that destroyed Florence Mabry and imprisoned Oscar Wilde are not legally operative. But the underlying question, who gets to control the narrative, who bears the cost of maintaining the public story, whether the gap between a society's stated values and its actual operating principles is managed consistently in the same direction. That question does not have a clean historical answer. It has an ongoing one. Victorian England built the most spectacular cage ever constructed, polished it until it shone like gold, and spent 64 years calling it a palace. We began with that image all those hours ago, standing outside the Crystal Palace in 1851. 6 million people came to look at it. It was extraordinary. It was genuinely impressive in ways that are not diminished by knowing what was happening inside it at the same time. Victorian England was both things simultaneously, a civilization of real achievement and real beauty, and a civilization whose achievement and beauty rested on a foundation of managed inequality that destroyed people who got in its way. That is not a paradox unique to the Victorians. It is the paradox of every civilization that has ever existed, including the ones we currently inhabit. The Victorian contribution to our understanding of it is simply that they did it in such extraordinary, documented, publicly examined detail in courtrooms and newspapers and parliamentary debates and private letters that survived, that we can actually trace the mechanism. We can watch it operate. We can name the specific moments where the scales tipped. And if we can name those moments in the past, we have at least a fighting chance of recognizing them in the present. I have spent a long time with these 10 people tonight. With Harriet Morton sitting in an asylum for 36 years, with Florence Bravo, who died at 33 by the sea, with Charles Dilke, brilliant and permanently stained by unresolved doubt, with Gertrude Campbell, who looked at the legal process being used against her and used it right back, with Florence Mabry, whose last known companion was a collection of cats in a Connecticut cottage, with Charles Stewart Parnell, who died at 45, knowing that the window had closed with Oscar Wilde, who refused to run and paid for it, and outlasted everyone who had tried to erase him. Their stories are not comfortable. They were not comfortable to live, and they are not comfortable to examine. But discomfort in the presence of the past is, I think, one of the more honest and useful emotions available to us. It means we're actually looking. Thank you for looking with me tonight. Thank you for staying through all of it. The drawing rooms and the courtrooms, the letters and the verdicts, the people who survived and the ones who did not. This kind of storytelling only works when there is someone at the other end willing to listen carefully, and you have done that. The comments below are yours. I would love to know which story landed hardest for you, which person you found yourself thinking about in a way you did not expect. Which moment made you stop and sit with it for a minute longer than the others? If this is the kind of journey you want to take again, then stay close, because the next story we're going to tell is waiting. And it is the kind of story that, like all the best ones, begins exactly where you would least expect it. The lights can stay soft a little longer. The night is not quite over yet.